to carry out their political programme. May hasn't done that, and she survived a no confidence vote in the Parliament pushed by Jeremy Corbyn by 19 votes. So first of all this week, I'm going to be asking place in the Conservative Party just weeks ago. They don't want Theresa May to be the leader of their little club of posh MPs, but they're perfectly happy for her to be the leader of a country of 60 odd million people, which I think says quite a lot. So for this first segment, I want to ask viewers, do you think the country has any faith left in Theresa May, in her government? Do you think we even know what Theresa May's government is about at this point? Given that her deal is dead in the water, what's she for? What's the government for? And do you think there should be a general election? Now, earlier in the week on Common Space, I put out a video, it was just yesterday actually, saying that there should absolutely be a general election. It's beyond me why people might think there shouldn't be a general election at this point. I see that a new consensus of sorts has formed, all the way from Jacob Rees-Mogg to Chuka Umunna, that there's no point in having a general election because that wouldn't end the current crisis. First of all, I think that emerging consensus is extremely interesting in itself, because we keep hearing how the political spectrum runs roughly from people like Jacob Rees-Mogg through Chuka Umunna. As far as I'm concerned, on the real fundamentals of British politics, they agree. And I think this is something incredibly important to bear in mind with the media so utterly saturated by Brexit as an issue. Ultra-Remainers like Chuka Umunna and ultra-Brexiteers like Jacob Rees-Mogg agree on all of the major policy principles of modern British politics. All of them basically agree in the marketisation of society. All of them basically agree on the current trajectory of British society, on not introducing, for example, the kinds of policies that Jeremy Corbyn, Chuka Umunna's leader, has been advocating. But the actual argument they are making, that there's no point in there being a general election because Jeremy Corbyn would then have to try and pursue a Brexit deal and we'd result in the same malaise. It's not for commentators or politicians to make that decision. When a government has failed this badly, the mandate must go to the people. And I find it slightly frightening the extent to which that what I thought was quite a basic and accepted idea in democracy has clearly diminished in standing in society. And any number of newspaper columnists, elected MPs now think that they know better than the public, even when the political system over which they have presided has ground to an absolute standstill. It's totally unprecedented that there would not be an election at this time, and it's the obvious next step in the people asserting what they think about British society in a period of unprecedented crisis. And I'd love to hear if people really think that there shouldn't be a general election at this point. Kieran Bruce says, if we crash out with no deal, where does that leave the possibility of a Section 30? The closer it gets, the more worried I am that the chance is slipping away. That's interesting, Kieran, and we are going to go on in our next section to discuss where next for British society and British politics in terms of the Brexit crisis. To be honest with you, and I think this is why the SNP need to be extremely proactive on independence and thrusting that as a demand into the political situation. All of the solutions that are currently being mooted to the Brexit crisis make Scottish independence and even a Scottish independence referendum less likely. So You said there, if there's a no deal Brexit, yes, it's true, of course, that the British state would be reluctant to plunge the country into even greater crisis by giving Scots the opportunity to vote to leave the United Kingdom. It should be said, by the way, that you sometimes hear Scottish independence discussed as like a life raft. Britain's going to go down the sinkhole and then Scotland can escape. That's not true under any scenario. If Britain were to crash out of the European Union with no deal, we'd still, even if we had an independence referendum that day, it would still, like with Brexit, be years of negotiations before we actually left the United Kingdom. Let alone, depending on what you think about whether Scotland would be fast-tracked back into the EU or would somehow maintain its EU membership status, which I don't think is true. But, let alone renegotiating our position in the European Union, it would be years of negotiations with the United Kingdom under those circumstances. But even if it were to be solved through something like Brexit is solved, and I'm going to get around to this point, this idea of solving Brexit, which I don't think is possible at this point. Even were it to be a people's vote, that would massively strengthen the political establishment. The People's Vote campaign are the campaign who are campaigning for a second EU referendum. If you haven't heard of People's Vote before, in Scotland a few years ago they went by a different name. It was called Better Together. People's Vote and Better Together basically represent the same social forces. It's Tony Blair, it's Alistair Campbell, it's the old New Labour clique. It's the right. It's the kind of centre right of the Conservative Party. It's the CBI. It's the business lobby. It's the same people who launched Better Together, and in some senses, it's the same project. It's about shoring up the establishment centre ground in British politics. Should there be a people's vote, and there's all kinds of problems with that, that will mean the return of creatures like Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell. That will mean the reassertion of their version of establishment politics. Incidentally, the leadership of the People's Vote campaign, people like Vince Cable, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, have already said that if there was a second referendum on leaving the EU, that would set the precedent for having a second referendum if Scots should vote for independence. That's important, by the way. He didn't say a second referendum whether Scots vote for independence or vote to remain in the Union. If Scots were to vote to remain in the Union, there wouldn't be a second vote. This is the precedent that's being set by the idea of a people's vote on Brexit. There'd be no question of a people's vote voting again on whether we should leave the European Union had we voted Remain. Everybody knows this. It's because the people voted the wrong way, according to this establishment set. The same's true of Scottish independence. If they establish that precedent now, when it comes to a second vote on Scottish independence, if people vote for independence, but only if they vote for independence, there'll have to be a second vote. And that entails all kinds of other complications. So on your point, Kieran, I think that it's vital that the SNP assert their demand for independence now. Get away from this Westminster circus around things like a people's vote. And it is a circus. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous right now down in Westminster. The no confidence motion in this government only lost by 19 votes. I believe the number of people who've signed up to a people's vote, to a second vote on the EU, is 108. And yet the media is still saying that 300 odd votes, no confidence in the government, the loss of that vote means there can't be a general election. But the support of just 108 MPs means that there definitely can be a people's vote. And so you can see this, like I say, this growing consensus across Labour, across the Labour backbenches certainly, and the Tory backbenches, throughout large sections of the media and civil society, groups like the CBI. They've already made up their mind, or are making up their mind, about how to resolve this crisis in their favour. And I think both the left with the general election and in Scotland the independence movement should make their pitch, because it's not a people's vote. That's not our politics. It's not an insurgent politics from the left, from the grassroots of British society. It's an elite project to resolve this crisis. And so I want to show you just another clip, which is May accepting that her deal is unpopular.
Mr. Speaker, the House has spoken and the Government will listen. It is clear that the House does not support this. Mr. Speaker, the House has spoken and the Government will listen. It is clear that the House does not support this. Mr. Speaker, the House has spoken.
So as I say, completely unprecedented times. There you have a Prime Minister admitting that her flagship policy is not wanted by the House. There's also no suggestion in any polling evidence that people want May's deal. May's deal, it's complicated and a bit of a mess, and it would change over time if it was actually implemented. But it's one of several versions that have been put forward that would basically mean that Britain was still, at least for a transition period, which is never ending, as far as we can tell, still subject to all the institutions of the European Union, but with zero say over how that institution operates. It should be said, to a significant degree, the people of Britain already, and other European countries which are members of the European Union, already have very little say, or next to none, what goes on in that institution. But the British state and the British government itself would have far less in the direction of the European Union, and would still be subject to the rules that govern the wider institution. There's Theresa May in the House of Commons admitting that it's been defeated more handedly than any major piece of government legislation in the entire history of the Parliament. I honestly don't see how that situation, as I say, is resolved other than through a general election. And the last thing I'll say about that before I move on to the next segment is that's not just about Brexit. This is a government with only failures to show for itself. There have been so many that it's actually quite difficult to recall them, but I'll recall some. Grenfell, the government's terrible handling of that as it came in. Even before that, of course, the government lost its majority in a misjudged election. At the Queen's speech, at the start of that government, it ditched most of the policies that it had campaigned on during its terrible election campaign. So this is a government which had resigned most of its commitments to the country even before it took office. Its signature policy achievements since it took office are a grossly mishandled Windrush scandal, which was itself the product of Theresa May's handling of the Home Office years before, and a very long-run racist immigration policy that targeted that generation. Another signature policy has been the nationalisation of some rail lines, which might sound appetising if you're on the left of politics, but in actual fact it was done because the private providers that the Tories have given away so much of our public infrastructure and public services to have been run into the ground and are completely dysfunctional, and the state has had to come along and pick up the can in much the same way, incidentally, as we did with the banks. That seems to be the Tories' idea, and as it happens, New Labour's idea of how nationalisation works, which is that private corporations make all the money, private corporations keep all the profits, they inevitably crash the enterprises they're involved in, and the state comes along and picks up the can. And another great policy coup for this government has been universal credit, the rollout of which is being stalled all over the place, and which is having catastrophic consequences for claimants of many benefits. So, actually there's more that I have to mention. The housing crisis, out of control. Homelessness, rising at a record rate around the country because of that housing crisis. A nascent crisis on the high streets. I saw that M&S shut another 6 stores this week up and down the country. Typically, it should be said, mostly in smaller post-industrial towns, but they're very much the bellwether for what's going to happen to the high streets in larger towns, in market towns and cities, and so on. And these are the sorts of issues that are just being completely ignored. We know that there's a major crisis coming on our high streets, which are a major driver now, the retail sector of the British economy, so much of the productive industry having been thrown away. And yet the government has no kind of plan to deal with this situation, is making no advanced planning because of the state of the Brexit crisis. So as I say, there are plenty of reasons to want that general election, and by the norms of British politics, there should now be a general election. The resistance to it, to me, suggests that the democratic deficit in British society is getting worse by the week or month, and it's terrifying to see a cross-house consensus that the more the crisis grips the country, the less democracy is useful. Which brings me on to the next issue I'm dealing with tonight, which is where next to resolve the Brexit crisis. So I've noticed, as I'm sure many other people have over the last few days, a proliferation of think pieces in newspapers focusing on what Labour's response to this crisis should be. Now, I think that's interesting. I think it's interesting, for example, you don't see the same process on the right. Right-wing newspapers are not full of wildly diverse arguments about what Tory party policy should be. Partly that's because the Tory party is just frozen by its own endless internal faction fight. The same groups have been saying the same things for years and years about how the EU as an issue should be resolved. But partly that's because May's intransigence, her strategy, is to drive internal differences within the left against each other. So, for example, figures like Paul Mason, who have now changed their political position, now changed their position on what the EU, what we should be doing with the EU on a dozen occasions, are becoming ever more desperate for the government to pick up their particular angle, whether it be a people's vote, which is one lobby inside the Labour Party, which is now extending from the right wing of the party into parts of the left, whether it's a Norway Plus type deal, whether it's to suspend the Brexit process altogether or rescind Article 50. Now, this for me, as I say, first of all, indicates that the right in politics are playing a good game in making the left infight when it should be the government itself which is in a crisis. This to me is totally the wrong way to approach Brexit as an issue. It's not the role of the left in the biggest crisis of the British state in decades. It's not the role of the left to find clean solutions to the British state's problem. The first issue that should concern the left should surely be to overturn our enemies, to defeat the British state at this impasse, to defeat the UK government. If you're in the independence movement, to me that's pretty straightforward. You should be demanding an independence referendum. Not just because you think independence is always the best way to solve all problems that afflict Scottish society. You should be demanding an independence referendum because that gives you an independent position in this debate. Without that demand, without a demand being made on the UK government from the SNP, from the independence movement for an independence referendum, the only choice that Ian Blackford, the SNP's Westminster leader, or Nicola Sturgeon have is to orientate on one of the solutions provided them by other Westminster forces, by other forces in the British elite. And that's why the SNP is orientated on a so-called people's vote. They're doing so in lieu of the demand for independence. And as I was saying earlier, these are people who are hostile to Scottish independence. People's Vote is a project which is actively hostile to Scottish independence because, apart from anything else, their leaders say that a People's Vote strategy would set a precedent not just to defeat Brexit, but to defeat Scottish independence. So for the leadership of the SNP to be going along with that is, from my point of view, pretty senseless. And it's also the reason why you see, for example, Ian Blackford going for a meeting with Theresa May, where, correct me if I'm wrong, a Scottish independence policy was not the thrust of that meeting with Theresa May. And so, for the independence movement in Scotland, not having an independent position right now is simply to surrender to an enemy political force. I'd say the same thing for the Labour Party and the demand of a general election. If you're in the opposition party and you're not demanding that you replace the government, you inevitably start to adopt lines that are shared by your enemies in politics. So instead of a general election, 70 odd Labour MPs have signed a letter demanding a people's vote. For them, this is a bit more logical because they're simply opposed to the Corbyn project in general, and they very much view a so-called people's vote not as a means to, go and ask the people again. Apart from anything else, by the way, with a people's vote, we don't know what the questions would be. They would very easily become 3 questions that split leave. So, for example, May's deal, no deal, or straightforward remain. And so there's big question marks around whether or not that would ever be viewed as democratically legitimate. But quite aside from that, the right-wing benches in the Labour Party want to use the demand of a people's vote to push Corbyn out the way, to push his entire project out the way. So when you see polls that say X number of Labour members, and remember Corbyn's still an incredibly popular figure within the Labour Party, X% of Labour Party members support a people's vote, perhaps, but if they knew that it meant the end of Corbyn, probably not. So, as I say, as far as I'm concerned, the way forward for the independence movement or for the left must involve putting forward our own independent positions. There's one last point I want to make about the Labour Party. Before that, I should say, please send me your questions, comments, etc. What do you think the next step is in British politics? What do you think the next step of the Brexit crisis is? What should we do right now? Not how do you think we ultimately resolve this crisis? What do you think we do next? What does the independence movement, for example, do next? There was an pro-independence demonstration outside of Holyrood earlier today. That seems to me to be a good next step. There needs to be a growing presence on the streets making that demand, pressuring the SNP to demand Scottish independence. But what do you think the independence movement's next step is in responding to this unprecedented Brexit crisis? What do you think the next step at a Westminster level is? Do you think it's a general election? Do you think it's a people's vote? Could you make an argument for a people's vote? But I just want to say this as well about the Labour Party's position, which is the Labour Party is a party with 500,000 members, and it's strange to me that the party knew that this crisis was coming for over a year. We've known that May's deal was always going to struggle to get through Parliament, and yet on the day of the vote, when May was crushed, there was no extra parliamentary presence outside. There was nothing outside the House of Commons organised by the Labour Party, despite the fact that Momentum, the group set up to support Jeremy Corbyn, has 40,000 plus members, despite the fact that the party has a membership of 500,000 people, making it by far the largest political party in the country, despite the fact that it has a host of allied organisations that it could call upon. Now, it should be said there was a demonstration organised by the People's Assembly against austerity just a few days before the vote, and I think there needs to be a great deal more of that. Unless there's extra parliamentary activity, it will be much more difficult to break the internal deadlock that exists within the Parliament. And Parliaments, whether it's Westminster or it's Holyrood, but especially where it's Westminster, where the Parliament is dominated by the parties that have long governed the British state, that's very much their realm. There needs to be a counterbalance outside of the Parliament, outside of the halls, the corridors rather, of power. So I'm going to move on to the third segment, but sorry, I've got a question from, can't see it. Right. Oh, I've got a question from YouTube by Lentil Odosin. I think it's a gamble to rely on that single factor of the EU when things from 2014 still have not been sorted. I think it's a gamble to rely on that single factor of the EU when things from 2014. I know what you're saying, Lentil, if that is indeed your name. It's a lovely name if it is. Sorry. If by that you mean that the issues of the Yes campaign in 2014 have not yet been sorted, I think that's very true. For example, the Growth Commission, the SNP's Growth Commission that was set up to investigate the economics of a future independent state, but also the economic policies of a future Yes campaign, or at least the official top tier economic policies of a Yes campaign on issues like currency. That report is in, but set to be debated at the SNP conference, this spring conference. So there's yet to be, in the leading party of the independence movement, a decision made on what sort of currency a future Yes campaign should campaign on. And this is important because within the independence movement itself, currency remains a very divisive issue. The Growth Commission report, of course, said that Scotland should enter into a sterlingisation relationship with the rest of the UK, which would mean that Scotland wouldn't have control under independence of its own monetary policy, which would undermine Scotland's ability to organise its economy in a way that would benefit Scottish society. That decision hasn't been made yet at the SNP conference, and we don't know for sure. I mean, there are rumblings that it won't be debated at the forthcoming conference. I should say that's an unsubstantiated rumour. That's what I've heard, could be completely false. But in any case, we don't have a policy to campaign on right at this very moment. And I think, to be honest, that's been a mistake. It's been a mistake to leave those issues hanging over this situation because of the nature of the British crisis, because it's changing so quickly, because things can turn around so quickly, and we can suddenly arrive at a crisis moment where initiative needs to be taken. We really should have sorted those issues months ago, years ago, and they could have been. I have to say, I think they could have been if the SNP leadership had been more open to the grassroots of the independence movement. I think there's a lot of good sense in the independence movement, in its grassroots. I think that's why the independence grassroots, as far as we can tell, have roundly rejected the Growth Commission proposal on currency. But to talk a little bit more and get back to me on that issue, if you want to ask a question or put forward your own opinion on that, I want to talk on my last segment tonight about the whether or not there's a civil war inside the SNP. Is there a civil war in the SNP? Now, I know that when the slogan of an SNP civil war was first put forward in the pages of Scottish newspapers, there was a campaign on social media very redolent of the sort of satirical humour that made the Scottish independence referendum movement such an enjoyable period on social media, with people sort of making mock-up battlefields and laughing about exchanges of haggis mortar and so on. mocking the idea there was a civil war. I mean, I think at the time, and this is when it first emerged in the Daily Record, if I remember, that allegations of sexual misconduct has been made against the former SNP Alex Salmond. That phrase, when it was first used, I think was wrong. I think it's quite an apt phrase now. I have to be honest. I think that you could describe what's going on inside the SNP as a civil war between its former leadership group and its present leadership group. Now, civil war, I mean, it's quite a hyperventilated statement anyway, that's often chucked around in British politics. But as much as any party can be said to be in a state of internal conflict, at least at its leadership level, I think you could say that about the SNP today. And I know why people resent that suggestion, because the SNP is, pound for pound in Scottish society, a huge political party. It has over 100,000 members in a country of 5 million people, and that strife inside the party hasn't touched most layers of the party. There aren't branches lining up against each other. The independence movement are not at each other's throat. People aren't in, thank God, Team Sturgeon or Team Salmond. I mean, that's not what's going on. But I do agree with commentators who are saying, I think Ian McWhirter made this point in his most recent column for the Herald, who are saying that it does this infighting at the top of the SNP does show the limitations of the SNP's model as quite a top-down hierarchical party, hierarchical organisation, where tensions within the organisations are basically held at the top of the party. The reason why I'd say I think you can say there's a civil war inside the SNP, and I want to hear from you, of course, if you think that's nonsense, if you don't think there is an SNP civil war. I think you can say that there has been, basically since the collapse of the SNP, the Scottish Government's case against Alex Salmond just shortly before court proceedings were about to begin. And let's not forget in debating this issue that the tragedy of this issue is that two women who lodged allegations against Alex Salmond, who lodged allegations against someone who is an incredibly powerful figure in Scottish society, who has a real following in the country, who's charismatic and has many followers and is remembered fondly by them for the role he played in the independence referendum. They made a difficult decision, to come forward with their complaints, and the complaints procedure, by the admission of the Scottish Government itself, that was engaged in, let them down incredibly badly. And it should never be forgotten in the midst of this debate that that's what's at the centre of it. But it remains the fact that the Scottish Government made a mess of that complaints procedure. And it should be remembered there's any number now of inquiries and other investigations into what precisely happened, and Sturgeon's meetings with Alex Salmond about this issue. But notwithstanding the issues at the heart of this situation, this is a wider political schism within the traditional leadership group in the SNP. So I think there are a range of areas where you can see clear lines of political differentiation opening up between the former leadership group in the SNP, some of whom were with Salmond all the way back to the days of the 79 group, when he was in an SNP faction which was on the left of the party. They differ, this old group around Salmond, many of whom are now former ministers and things like that, and the new leadership, as it were, around Nicola Sturgeon. They differ on independence policy. In fact, Alex Salmond used the platform given by his court victory to say that Nicola Sturgeon should focus on independence. All of this stuff's calculated. None of this stuff just comes off the cuff. All of it's said for political reasons. And Alex Salmond has been channeling sentiments in the party that the demands for independence haven't been made aggressively enough by the SNP in the last couple of years. I think there's actually also a certain schism in the party on matters of foreign policy. I think that emerged, for example, around the Skripal affair, where Nicola Sturgeon was thought by some more marginal voices inside her own party to have gone too close to the UK government line in what it was saying about Russian involvement, Russian responsibility rather for the Skripal attack. I think there's obviously differences on Brexit policy with those around Salmond or in his current thinking saying that in a sense Brexit has been made too much out of in terms of a reason for Scottish independence. In fact, Alex Salmond's line on this has traditionally been Brexit is the occasion for Scottish independence, but it's not the reason for Scottish independence. And these wider political issues have clustered around this confrontation over the allegations made by two women of sexual misconduct against Alex Salmond. Joe Turner on YouTube says the currency transition period. So this a moment ago we were talking about the Growth Commission and currency. The currency transition period must be as short as possible. We would have no true independence while the Bank of England controlled the currency. I think that's true, but I think there's a vital debate about the transition here. So, for example, Commonweal, and full disclosure here, I work for Common Space, which is the independent media wing attached to Commonweal, Editorial Independent. Commonweal, the work they've done this suggests that a new currency can be transitioned to over 3 years. That's the 3-year transition period during which there'd be negotiations between a nascent Scottish state and the British state, during which any number of issues would be debated. The division of assets and liabilities in the British state, for example, what we'd be taking with us, what debts we'd be leaving behind, and so on. But the currency would be one of those issues, and it would be one of those issues that was debated. So it would take those 3 years. It needn't take any more time than that. I think if you have a Scottish, you could have that independent currency from day one. I think if after day one you try and establish that currency, you find it would be extremely difficult. And I think that's something not actually made clear in the Growth Commission. One last question from no name, but there is a question. Can we not simply arrange IndyRef ourselves before Brexit, even if the UK don't acknowledge it? We would be able to argue that we have a basis for staying inside the EU. I mean, in lieu of there being a demand from the Scottish Government, from the SNP for a Scottish independence referendum, you could have something like that. That takes you more in the direction of Catalonia, a Catalonia type scenario. But I think the first step has to be a formal request for independence and keeping things like that in reserve. So thanks for those questions. If you have any other questions, do keep sending them in, but we are running out of time here on Beyond the Noise Live. I've been discussing the week that Theresa May's deal finally fell apart, and is there a civil war inside the SNP? Do keep sending in questions, and I'll try and address